Welcome! This video reviews Wisconsin's updated wall bracing rules for 1 and 2 family dwellings. The purpose of the wall bracing rules is to assure homes in Wisconsin are safe from severe wind and weather. To achieve this goal, the department requires home designers to show how a home's walls handle the pressures of severe wind and weather. An important change has recently taken place. On April 1, 2014, the emergency rule for wall bracing took effect. That means plans submitted after April 1, 2014 must follow the emergency rule. We'll review some of the important changes in this video. First, it is important to understand why these changes were made. Home builders, suppliers, contractors, designers, inspectors, and members of the public voiced concerns about the old wall bracing requirements. They said the requirements were hard to understand and difficult to apply. They asked for change, and we listened. Recommendations and input were taken from everyone who contacted the department. The recommendations were then considered by the Uniform Dwelling Code Council. The council includes builders, suppliers, inspectors, contractors, and designers. Over the course of several months, the council determined how to make the rules easier to understand and apply. The council unanimously supported adoption of the emergency rule. Where is the emergency rule? To find a copy of the rule and to find other useful resources, go to dsps.wi.gov or search DSPS Wisconsin in any of the major search browsers. Let's take a quick look. We're going to do a simple search for DSPS Wisconsin. The first result is the department's website. Go ahead and click on the link. Now we're on the department's homepage, and we'll choose Industry Services. Next, click All Programs. We'll drop down to the link for 1 and 2 family dwellings. The Uniform Dwelling Code webpage features the wall bracing changes, and if we click on the link, we'll find the text of the emergency rule. The page also contains the wall bracing compliance worksheet that this video will walk through, and a how-to guide sheet. I'd encourage you to pause the video for a moment, as it may be helpful to skim these documents before moving forward. The emergency rule recognizes that there are several ways a wall can be adequately braced. It recognizes 2 methods of wall bracing that have strict requirements but provide clear guidance about how much bracing is required. They are the intermittent wall bracing and continuous sheathing methods. It also recognizes a more flexible approach, bracing by engineered design. Examples of intermittent wall bracing include let-in bracing and the use of diagonal wood boards and wood structural panels, among others. A complete list of acceptable intermittent bracing techniques can be found in the emergency rule. Continuous sheathing may be accomplished with wood structural panels or structural fiberboard sheathing. Finally, bracing by engineered design is a more flexible approach. A designer must prove the wall bracing design protects the home against wind by submitting designs and specifications that follow acceptable engineering practices. The department created this one-page worksheet so designers can easily show that the home design meets the requirements of the emergency rule. The worksheet or equivalent information must be submitted with the permit application. This video will demonstrate how to fill out the form with simple examples. The compliance worksheet starts by requesting a sketch of the building plan and the dimensions. Here's our simple sketch. and the dimensions that go with it. Then you'll notice that the compliance worksheet asks for wall bracing rectangles in the drawing. Wall bracing rectangles are very important in the emergency rule. To explain why, let's suppose we are in a windy neighborhood with a small house and a large house. Because the big house has more surface area, it catches more wind than the small house. Drawing rectangles around the proposed building plan is a tool to identify the surface areas of the building that will catch wind. The length of each rectangle side is especially important, as we'll see in a moment. To draw the wall brace rectangles using the floor plan, we're going to use what's called the rectangular method. With our simple home, we can draw one large rectangle around it. Alternatively, we can take our same simple home and draw two smaller rectangles. When multiple rectangles are used, each rectangle is braced as though it were a separate building, and the bracing amount is added together along the common wall. Why does it matter how the rectangles are drawn? Well, the emergency rule sets limits on how long a rectangle side can be. 75 feet is the limit if intermittent bracing is used. 80 feet is the limit if continuous bracing is used. If a rectangle side is longer than these limits, the designer must draw one or more additional rectangles, or an engineered design must be submitted. The length to width ratio of perpendicular rectangle sides cannot be greater than 3:1. For example, if one side is 8 times longer than the perpendicular side, that is not acceptable under the emergency rule without an engineered design. To see these limits in action, look back to our rectangle drawings. On the left, the long rectangle side is 100 feet in length, and that exceeds both rectangle length limits. The alternative is acceptable. 70 feet and 30 feet are both below the required limits, whether the sides are continuously or intermittently braced. There are certain elements of the home that are excluded from the wall bracing rectangle. Here I've drawn a chimney along the side of the house that is not enclosed by our drawn rectangles because chimneys are excluded from the wall bracing rectangle. This prevents the length of the rectangle from being affected by small projections from the home. Before drawing rectangle lines around the plans, check the list of excluded elements first, and do not draw rectangles around these items. All right, let's bring it back to the compliance worksheet and see the completed diagram. It has our sketch, dimensions, and rectangles. The rectangles are labeled A and B, so a reviewer can tell what area we're referring to. Rectangles A and B represent the first floor of a house with 2 floor levels. If the second floor uses different bracing than the first floor, it should be given a distinct label, like C. The emergency rule contains certain assumptions. These assumptions reflect common choices in the construction and location of homes in Wisconsin. For example, the rule assumes that the interior side of exterior walls are sheathed with half-inch gypsum board. It also assumes a maximum 10-foot wall height. Finally, it assumes that the house is in an area that experiences Category B wind exposure. Category B refers to urban and suburban areas with numerous closely spaced obstructions that affect the wind strength. Of course, these assumptions may not hold for every building, and the emergency rule contains adjustment factors for each assumption listed here. For example, if the sheathing materials are some material other than half-inch gypsum wallboard, you must multiply the required amount of wall bracing by 1.40. In situations where the wall height is not 10 feet, you must multiply the bracing required by the following factors. The multipliers are slightly different depending on what type of bracing is used. In situations where the wind is not Category B, again we must use a multiplier. Category C refers to areas of flat, open country, and grasslands with scattered obstructions. The required bracing in these areas is multiplied by 1.3. Category D refers to areas of flat, unobstructed land exposed to wind flowing over open water for a distance of at least 1 mile. Category D's multiplier is 1.6. Next, we state some important details about the house. You can see there's a row for summary information at the top. Let's zoom in. First, the form asks what rectangle we're talking about. These are simply assigned a letter. Next, what is the wall height on the rectangle side? We'll use a standard 10-foot wall. The eave to ridge height gives us an idea of how much wind our roof will catch. In this case, it is 10 feet. The maximum opening height generally refers to the tallest door or window on the rectangle side. We'll be on the second floor of our example house for the upcoming examples, and that level only has windows, the largest with an opening of 4 feet. The maximum opening height is the measured height of the opening itself and not necessarily the height from the floor to the top of the opening. Finally, the wind exposure category refers to how strong the winds are in the area where the house is built. We are building in suburban area with Category B wind exposure. The method chosen for bracing will determine the next step. You can see in the columns the two methods mentioned earlier, intermittent and continuous. There is no column for engineering because engineered designs require documentation beyond this worksheet to comply with the emergency rule. PF stands for portal frame. This method interacts with the intermittent and continuous methods. We'll return to the PF method shortly. Each prescriptive method requires finding the minimum panel width. 3 resources are available to assist us in finding the appropriate panel width. For intermittent, it's Table G. For continuous, it's Table H. And for the portal frame method, it's Figure A. We're getting into the differences between each method, so we'll explore each more in depth now. We'll start with the intermittent bracing method. All right, here we are in Table G. Let's suppose that we've used the intermittent bracing method in wood structural panel for bracing. We want to find out what the minimum braced wall panel width is. We go down the table and find that it is 48 inches. To bring that result back to the compliance worksheet, we look at the column for intermittent method and enter 48 inches in the space provided under minimum panel width. Now that the minimum width is set at 48 inches, how many intermittently braced wall panels are needed? The emergency rule states that 2 braced wall panels is the minimum. Table I will give us the exact required amount. The number of panels required depends on 2 things. First, what is the wall supporting? For example, in a home with 3 floor levels, the ground floor supports the second floor, third floor, roof, and ceiling. As a result, those walls require more panels with intermittent bracing. Second, the number of panels depends on the length of the perpendicular rectangle side because wind pushing against one side puts racking pressure on the perpendicular sides. Perpendicular sides meet at 90-degree angles like a T intersection. We are looking at the second floor that supports the roof and ceiling only. In the table, that's the first row. This row refers to walls supporting the roof and ceiling only. Next, we look for the length of the perpendicular rectangle side. In our figure, it's 50 feet. In the table, that's the second column. The chart states that when the perpendicular side is 50 feet and the floor level supports the roof and ceiling only, the number of required brace panels is 2. To enter our result in the correct space, remember that we chose to use the intermittent method. We are looking from the perspective of the second floor that supports the roof and ceiling only. The 70-foot rectangle side is also the long side because it is relatively longer than its perpendicular neighbor, the 50-foot side. As a result, we'll enter 2 braced wall panels here. Next, we'll look at an example using the continuous sheathing method. On the second floor of our example home, what does continuous bracing on the 70-foot rectangle side look like? With the continuous sheathing method, all surfaces that can be sheathed must be sheathed. Of course, door and window openings are not sheathed. The most effective bracing comes from areas where the sheathing is the full height of the wall and meets minimum width requirements. These areas are the CS braced wall panels. Meeting the full height and minimum width requirements allow the CS braced wall panels to withstand racking forces. In this house, the braced wall panels are the full height of the wall. They also meet minimum width requirements. Compared to a house with paneling that is not full height, this house is more susceptible to wind-induced racking. Let's look at one rectangle side that roughly tracks the side of the home. There are 2 braced wall panels in our figure. Each area of braced wall panel counts toward the total length of bracing required. Adding the widths of each panel gives us the total length of the bracing on this side. In contrast, the sheathing on the left side is too narrow to count as a braced wall panel. It does not contribute to the total length of bracing required. Similarly, this area above and below the window opening is sheathed, but the panels are not full height. They also do not contribute to the total length of bracing required. Under the continuous sheathing method, we will need to find the minimum width of each panel and the total length of bracing required. Another way to think about this is with a simple equation. In a minute, we'll calculate some of these values, but for now, we'll accept them as a given. On the left side of the equation, we have the required total length of all CS panels on one rectangle side is 7.5 feet or 90 inches. Each panel that makes up the total length must meet minimum width requirements. For this reason, we will divide the total length of bracing required by the minimum width of each panel. Given this, the minimum number of braced wall panels we can use is 3. A designer who is required to use 90 inches of continuous braced panels could use 120 inches instead. For simplicity, we will assume in our examples that the designer follows the exact requirements of the emergency rule. To find the total length of continuous bracing required, we'll use Table J in the emergency rule. We need to know the eave to ridge height of the roof, the floor level, and the length of the perpendicular rectangle side. The chart of values contains the answer we're looking for. What is the length of continuous bracing required on our 70-foot rectangle side? After consulting the design, we know that the eave to ridge height of the roof is 10 feet. That is the first row values. Next, the 70-foot wall is on the second floor and supports the roof and ceiling only. Finally, we look for the length of the perpendicular side. Our figure shows that the perpendicular side is 50 feet. The answer is 7.5 feet. To say it a different way, the total of all CS braced wall panels on the 70-foot rectangle side must be at least 7.5 feet. Next, we'll touch briefly on the portal frame brace construction method. The legs of portal frames are a narrower panel, but may still contribute to the required bracing on a rectangle side. When portal frames are counted with the intermittent method, each PF panel counts as half of the braced wall panel. When portal frames are counted with the continuous method, the actual width of each PF panel counts toward the required total length of bracing. Importantly, each PF panel that meets the minimum required width for braced wall panels is counted just like a braced wall panel. Once we know how much paneling is required, the final step is to find out where we can put it. Here we have one rectangle side with two braced wall panels. There are two important requirements to be aware of when choosing where to place the braced wall panels. First, a braced wall panel must be no more than 12 feet 6 inches from the end of the rectangle side. Second, the distance between braced wall panels cannot be greater than 21 feet. The 21 feet is measured as a straight line and ignores offsets in the wall like the one represented here. We'll end with a few brief but important notes. First, does this video cover the entire emergency rule? No, it does not. The full text of the emergency rule, the worksheet, and a how-to guide can be found on the Department of Safety and Professional Services website. The emergency rule is temporary, and a permanent rule to replace it is currently under consideration. The permanent rule is reviewed by the Department, Governor, Legislature, and most importantly, interested members of the public before it becomes effective. If approved, the permanent rule will solidify some of the emergency rule's requirements and provide additional clarification. Good rules do not come about overnight. We consider feedback from all sources before a rule becomes permanent. With that, I'd like to thank you for watching and invite you to visit the department's webpage on wall bracing to learn more, or email at dsspudtech@wisconsin.gov, or call us at area code 608-266-2112.